Once again, our most amazing invention was in a state of nerves and near panic. That invention, of course, is culture. Sociologically speaking, culture, according to my excellent Random House dictionary, is the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of human beings and transmitted from one generation to another. The sum total of ways of living, but the human way of living, an invented, a contrived, a different way of living from that with which we were originally endowed. That's what makes it shaky at times. Culture is an invention. It's something we consider to be an improvement over the so-called natural way in which we found ourselves, living in the forests and savannas, living off the bounty of nature, as do all other so-called wild creatures on Earth. Much of human culture rests upon economics. Staying with my Random House dictionary, economics is the science dealing with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, or the material welfare of mankind. Without material welfare, everything else tends to break down. As a species, it's too late to return to the forests, savannas, and beaches, to that island time of which Mr. Stetzel writes in his book School for the Young. We've been too long gone from that kind of existence. It's as Thomas Wolfe once put it, you can't go home again. Evolutionally, we've burned our bridges behind us, and we stand today on the continent we've chosen. There's no going back, even if we wanted to, and you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find many who'd even want to go back. We invented culture, we invented economics, and even called it a science, believe it or not. E.F. Schumacher, in his book Small is Beautiful, states that economics is not a science at all, but rather an imperfect art form with which we continue to struggle as we search for stability. But what does all of this mean to you and me? Well, certainly we as persons can't do much about global economics and stability of human culture. Well, to an extent, we can do something about it. We can make certain that the organization of which we are the head, our family, and in many cases our business firms, are in good economic order. If the economic order is good, that which is built upon it, culture, this business of living as intelligent and civilized human beings and doing some of the things we like to do, is possible. If the economic base is bad, the entire hierarchy of things which make culture culture tends to collapse, and everything becomes very primary again, very primitive. It becomes a matter of food and shelter. And when staying alive and out of the elements become the primary considerations of the human creature, much of what makes him human tends to fade. The first thing to disappear when you're hungry is your sense of humor, and when you're struggling for survival, the good of the species becomes academic. But let's keep economics in its place. Things seem to be in a state of turmoil, and whenever this happens, I dig down for basics. Now, we have them with the facts of culture and economics, with those very human inventions which we shall consider to be basically good as starting points. Where do we go from there? For answers of this kind, you simply cannot do better than to go back to that ugly philosopher, Socrates, son of a stonecutter and a midwife, enormously strong, very brave, charming, and brilliant. He believed that success could never be more than a short-term affair unless it was founded on logical truth and moral right. He told us what the most prized possession is, the one good and the one evil. Do you remember what they were? In times like these, it's easy to forget. Once, when looking at a variety of merchandise exposed for sale, Socrates was heard to observe, "How many things I can do without." He said he was nearest to the gods because he had the least number of wants. About that most prized possession, Socrates said that it's leisure. And he recognized only one good, knowledge, and only one evil, ignorance. He married twice, the second time to Xantippe, a shrew who screamed at him whenever he was within earshot and often hit him, sometimes even in public. When asked why he put up with such behavior, he said in effect that it was good training because if you could stand her, you could stand anything else that might happen to you. And when someone asked him whether to marry or not, Socrates replied, "Either way, you will repent it." In his excellent book, Understanding Philosophy, A Popular History of Ideas, Professor Feebleman writes that lurking behind the conversations of Socrates, there can be detected the ultimate question of human behavior. What is the final end of man? To enrich himself while he's alive? To cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues? Or to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it? Most men would choose the first. Socrates liked the second, And I myself, Professor Feebleman writes, prefer the third. I'll go over them again. The first is to enrich himself while he's alive. The second is to cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues. And the third, the one that Professor Feebleman prefers, is to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it. Now, Socrates was thought to be the wisest man of his times. The oracle at Delphi said he was the wisest man. When he learned of that, the only answer that Socrates could give was that if he were indeed the wisest man alive, it was because he knew what he did not know. He placed so little value on what he thought and said that he never wrote down a word for posterity, nor would he accept money for his teachings. He remains to this day one of the wisest human beings the world ever produced, and his teachings represent a rock-solid foundation on which to build a life or a business. He said success can never be more than a short-term affair unless it's founded on logical truth and moral right. Leisure is the most prized of possessions. The only good is knowledge. The only evil, ignorance. Doesn't take long to learn his philosophy, does it? And what is the final end of a person? To enrich himself while he's alive? To cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues? Or to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it? Well, as to choosing a way to live, a nice balance of those three choices can be achieved. Chances are that a person would lean a bit toward one or the other, but he could do all three. He could cultivate a strong character and many personal virtues, be so productive that he could leave the world a better place for his having lived in it, and at the same time enrich himself to a sufficient extent that he could live what we might call the good life. And that's what a person might be thinking about these days, the basics. They tend to clear the mind and get things on a solid footing once again. The other morning, driving to my office, I heard one of my own radio programs in which I recommended writing our problems down on paper. I still think it's an excellent idea. It's been said that a problem defined is half solved, and if we find ourselves enmeshed in the coils of the times, we can write our problems down and then, reminding ourselves of Socrates' excellent advice, begin from there. I imagine most people are rather surprised to find that Socrates declared leisure to be the most prized of possessions. If they do, it's because they've confused leisure with doing nothing. We would not have culture or economics or books telling us about Socrates if we had not had leisure. Remember that Newton was sitting under the apple tree when that apple dropped on his head. Our best ideas invariably come to us in periods of leisure. Leisure not only helps us find the ideas we're looking for, it rests us for the labor of putting those ideas into action. Millions spend their days at work they dislike or at best tolerate so that they may enjoy their leisure. Leisure is what it's all about, and Socrates knew that. His great dialogues, recorded so faithfully by Plato, were conducted at leisure. Plato, a wealthy aristocrat, had the leisure to write and to think and to imagine what the ideal city-state might be like. And his student, Aristotle, had the leisure to think and write. In our society, most of us can provide our children with the leisure to go to school for as long as they deem necessary. Although few of them would consider school leisure, it would be impossible or very difficult without it. Socrates had a fixed goal in life, to lead men to the truth. The truth, he thought, could not fail to win out in the end, regardless of its temporary consequences, and the truth, he also believed, would make virtue unassailable. Unfortunately, Socrates got mixed up with a losing side in a political struggle. His enemies, led by Miletus, accused him of corrupting the youth by making the worse cause appear the better, and they condemned him to death. He was, in a way, almost a religious figure of reason incarnate and the world's first martyr to the truth. Actually, as Professor Feebleman reminds us, those who had convicted him did not want to see him a martyr, and his friends were allowed to conspire with the jailer to help him escape, but he refused. And in the Phaedo, in one of the most moving accounts in all literature, Plato describes his last day in his cell with his friends and the manner of his execution. He was condemned to drink hemlock, a deadly poison, and did so, discoursing all the while on philosophy while his friends stood around him and wept. After his death, the Athenians felt such remorse that they closed the schools, put Miletus to death, and banished the other accusers. Then they honored Socrates with a bronze statue, which did not, of course, bring him back, although it did much to spread his teaching, which was left chiefly to his pupils. It's believed that Socrates lived to be 70, which was a pretty good old age for the time, 399 B.C. In the centuries, between the time of Socrates and our own time, we've had as many ups and downs as there have been seasons of the years. But we've never had a clearer thinker than Socrates. We can put his wisdom to work in our lives today, and we will achieve, without fail, the results we seek. I mentioned E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful. In a paper on meta-economics contributed to the volume Beyond Keynes, edited by Joan Robinson, Dr. Schumacher shows at the conclusion of his paper, as reported in Manus, that the attempt to describe and eventually to control the economic activities of human beings by means of economic models necessarily requires a ruthless and extreme simplification of the picture of man. Man is seen either as a mechanical robot whose reactions are ascertainable and predictable like those of mindless matter, or as a rational homo economicus solely concerned with material self-enrichment. Neither of these two pictures bears the mark of humanity. An economic teaching built on such a basis cannot possibly be helpful in solving the economic problems now oppressing us, and I'd go so far as to say, he writes, that the intensive study of such a teaching, although it may in some respects be useful, does considerably more harm than good. For every man in the course of his life becomes what he thinks, is formed by his thoughts. If what he thinks is narrow and unreal, he himself becomes narrow and unreal. Now, as Manus points out, this gets to the point. If we approach our problems as something economic science can solve, then we shall be behaving in exactly the way we've behaved in the past. Economic man is helpless to change as economic man. Even prudential considerations applied toward conservation do not work, as Aldo Leopold shows in the concluding chapter of his Sand County Almanac. After describing the failures of conservation based upon economic calculations, he says, "It is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for the land and a high regard for its value. And by value, I of course mean something far broader than mere economic value. I mean